Hello and welcome to this demonstration of winning a bishop and pawns chess endgame. And if we take a look at this position, it is black to move here. And so if you were playing this, what would you do in this position? How would you try and get an advantage with black? Or if you were white, how would you play? So one good rule of thumb in bishop endgames and also in general when bishops are involved, you would normally want to place your pawns on the opposite colored squares as your bishop to allow your bishop more mobility. So if we see here, we notice that black has a bishop that is on the light squares and all of his pawns are on the dark squares. And so they will not slow down the path of his bishop and prevent it from moving. His bishop can just move around his pawns. And we see here that white has many pawns on the light squares. And so they may become targets for black's bishop here. Because they're on the light squares. But also, we see that white has the same colored bishop, a light square bishop as well, but the pawns may end up getting in the way of his bishop and limiting the scope of his bishop, as we'll find out here. All right, so let's begin. If you want to look at the position more and try and guess how black will begin, you can pause the video. If not, let's continue here. All right, so the analysis, the evaluation here is that black is slightly ahead, and we'll see that even though material is even, we notice that white has 3 pawn islands, one group of pawns here, and another smaller group here, and a single isolated pawn in the center here. And so that can also be harder to defend, especially this isolated pawn here. And so black will begin by attacking this pawn chain that is on the same color squares as his bishop. And so he moves to b1, attacking the base of the pawn chain, which is generally the weakest link in the chain. And so it's usually a good idea to attack the base of the chain. Why is that weak? Well, because there are no more pawns that can protect that base of the chain. Whereas in the middle, this B pawn is protected by the A pawn, and the top of the chain, the C pawn, is protected, of course, by the B pawn. So this is the weak link in the chain, and black wastes no time in attacking it with his bishop. And so this forces white to move to a3 to avoid the loss of this pawn. And so now we have a5, a good move here by black, which prevents these pawns from pushing forward on the dark squares, as if now if b4 is played, a would take b4, and then if a recapture, the c pawn would recapture, and black would have a passed pawn over here. And also, this puts this pawn, the a pawn of black's, on a dark square. So now, once again, all of these pawns are on the dark squares and cannot be attacked by white's bishop here. All right, so bishop to d1 to protect this base of the chain here now. Now the b pawn is the base of a chain as this pawn is moved forward. And the bishop has to move here, otherwise black would have just moved to c2 and attacked the b3 pawn. So now we have the kings moving into the action. And that is another good rule of thumb, is to try and activate your kings in the endgame, especially when there are not many pieces on the board and the kings are no longer in danger. It is usually a good idea to rush them into the battle and try and use them to attack and control squares. All right, so white does the same. And so the kings race towards the center. And now we have the kings kind of opposing each other. The black king is trying to move in here, and especially to get over here and help attack these pawns, and maybe hold back this e-pawn as well. And so white decides to push forward here. And so maybe this is not the best move, as it locks all his pawns on light squares where they can be targets for this black bishop. So if we go back and look at the computer evaluation, the computer wanted h4 here, which would take this pawn off the light squares and push it forward onto a dark square. But white did not play that. He plays a4. And so black responds with g5 now. So this once again keeps black's pawns on the dark squares and pushes forward, gathering more space. And now we will see how white responds. So white is running out of moves here. We see king to e2 is played, and now black responds with a bishop move, attacking this undefended pawn on h3. And so in this position, g4 is played, which locks the pawns here on the h and g files onto this light square, these light squares, where there'll be constant targets of the bishop now. And so if black would have tried something different, let's see, instead of g4, if h4 were played, well, now we see that the game swings completely in black's favor, and we would have had bishop to g4 trading off the bishops here. And so after bishop trades, now the black king moves into the position. And if white tried to stop him, well, then he will run out of moves here. And once this pawn moves forward, now white would lose ground and have to retreat, either left or right. But the black king would be able to move in and invade white's position and pick off pawns, allowing a promotion of his pawns. So once again, this highlights how important it is to use your kings in the endgame. All right, so if we go back, instead of, after this bishop to f5, attacking the h3 pawn, instead of pushing that pawn forward, g4 is played, attacking the bishop. So the bishop will retreat here back to b1, and now the king moves up to try and prevent the black king from making any headway and moving forward here. And now black pushes a pawn forward. So in a group of pawns, if you have a pawn that is unopposed, it's usually a good idea to push that pawn forward if you have a pawn majority. And here, this f pawn of black's has no pawn in front of it, although this e pawn could slow down a forward push, of course, by this this f pawn. But as we will see, after f4, g takes f5 is played. And here we could see what would happen if that pawn was not captured. So instead, if king to e2 were played, excuse me, let me go back. All right, so if king to e2 were played or retreat, well, that would allow bishop to e4, further limiting white from not being able to move to d3 or f3, and then the game may progress with the king moving over here to prevent the bishop from swooping in and attacking this h3 pawn. And so then now the pawn can push forward, and after a capture, the king captures. And now black's king is invading into the position here, and white is running out of moves. He would have to try and just move his bishop. Well, excuse me. If he moves his bishop, then we have bishop to c2 here. So the king would have to move, and this would allow an invasion by black's king. All right, so if we go back, after f5, g takes f5 is played. So then king captures, and then now, once again, white is running out of moves here. What does he do? He can't push this pawn forward or it'll just be captured. If he pushes this pawn, of course, it would be captured. So the bishop cannot move, or black's bishop will move to c2 and start picking off these pawns. So king to f2 is played. If king to f3 were played here, or excuse me, g3, then black would, of course, gone over and attacked this isolated pawn. So after the king retreat, we have bishop to e3, or excuse me, bishop to e4, and then the king just moves back and forth. So white is just really running out of options here, and now black makes a retreating move, which is interesting, but this has meaning. He moves back here to help prepare an h pawn push forward, so that it cannot be captured by this light squared bishop of white's. So the king once again moves back, and then finally we have this h pawn push. The king moves again, and now h4, taking away another square from this king. And so the king moves back, as if he moved forward. Then the bishop would have just attacked and possibly chased the king away. So we have bishop to f5 now attacking this pawn. And so the king moves to protect it. Now black's king will move into the center, as the king is stuck here trying to protect this pawn. The bishop is kind of stuck playing guard duty here. And so what can black do, or excuse me, what can white do in this position now but just move back and forth protecting this h3 pawn, and this will allow the black king to invade into white's position. So the king moves forward, and now the bishop retreats back here, so that he could possibly attack from a2 with the help of the king against this b pawn. And so white tries to move over, but now the black king is invading. So after king to d3 here, black has achieved his goal of moving his king into the position. And so the white king moves up to try and escort his passed pawn forward, but now the bishop is being attacked. So the bishop must move up, and then we have bishop to f5 here, cutting off the white king. But in this position, black resigned here, or excuse me, white resigned. So in this position, white resigned here, but I'll play out some further possibilities because they are a good demonstration of how to win with bishops and in a bishop and pawns endgame. All right, so a few different options here. If this pawn is just pushed forward attacking the bishop, well, then we would just have an immediate capture. King captures, and after this trade, we see that black would be able to pick off this h3 pawn while protecting his pawn and escort it forward. And so that is one way that black could win in this scenario. So another possibility after this bishop to f5 move is bishop to f1, because black's bishop is attacking this h3 pawn. So if the bishop moves to protect it, well, now we have king to c3 attacking a pawn, and then e4 could be played, but the bishop would just retreat, and this gives time for the black king to start picking off pawns. And now the white king could move forward to try and assist the advance of this passed pawn. But after another capture of white's pawns now, the game may continue like this. So finally this pawn is pushed forward, but now black can just capture. And after a recapture, we see that we have 5 pawns to 2, but white has this extra bishop. And so maybe the game would continue with the pawn pushing forward here. And in this position, we see that black is winning, as if the pawn were, if white tries to stop the pawn with this bishop, then the pawn just keeps pushing forward until the bishop moves here. Now the king can just attack that bishop. And so, after the bishop retreats, of course, the pawn will promote and black would be winning here. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this demonstration of how to win in a bishop and pawns endgame. Perhaps in the future I would do more of these, because there is a lot to learn in different types of endgames, especially bishops. But when you have the same color bishops and pawns endgame, just remember to try not to limit the scope of your bishop by having your pawns on the same color squares. So a good rule of thumb is to try and put your pawns on the opposite colored squares as your bishop. That way you can maneuver around you can maneuver around your pawns, and especially if your opponent has the same color bishop, then you will be able to use that to your advantage. Let's see here. I'll go back to the beginning and just show you real quick. So this is what I'm talking about. In the beginning of this position, we see that you have your bishop on the opposite colored squares as your pawns. And so this allows your bishop more mobility, and also because it's on the opposite color, your opponent cannot attack your pawns either. So this gave black a big advantage and allowed him to win in this endgame. And we see that white had pawns that were on the same color as his bishop, so the bishop was trapped behind his pawns some of the time, and he was playing defense, trying to protect these pawns that came under attack by black's bishop. All right, well, just remember that. Place your pawns on the opposite colored squares as your bishops. Now there are exceptions to the rule. Sometimes you may want to place them on the same color, especially if it is limiting your opponent's bishop or maybe attacking in some way. So there are exceptions, and that's what makes chess so interesting, all the exceptions to the rules and guidelines. Also, remember to use your king, activate your king, and use it to fight, especially in the end game when there's not as much danger. of bringing the king out into the middle of the board. All right, well, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions, and have a great day, everyone.